I'm going to give the session to Lauren and Fallon. You guys, great to see you. So excited about today's session. These guys don't even know what's in store for them.
Oh no, should I be scared?
Oh no, your audience, because it's so cool. So
oh,
yeah.
I thought you were talking about me and Fallon. I'm like, oh my gosh, what did we just step into? No, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting us to join your group and to talk about actually a topic that I know both Fallon and I are really passionate about. And Daniel, I really wanted to thank you for joining us as well, because I think it's really nice to not just give us an opportunity to talk about some of the learnings, I guess, that we've had over the years, and hopefully a lot of them are helpful to the folks on the call. But you know, it's if we can, I don't know, create a bit of a conversation maybe around some of these topics. Daniel, I would imagine that you have some real world experience and some classroom ideas that you could add into this as well. So certainly for the Q&A session, I think people would expect to hear from you, but I also wanted to just open it up and say that at any point, if there are relevant stories or lessons that you want to add, we have plenty of times to pause over the course of our hour together today, where I think your insights would be really valuable for the people on the call.
Okay, sounds good.
Right. So I think, you know, from the perspective of what Fallon and I do and what Contenio does, we're really focused on how do we get teams to collaborate effectively in order to identify all of the bits of a project or a product or an eventual goal that need to occur right from ideation all the way through to prioritizing in order to deliver value to customers. Right, so for a lot of us on the call, that means products that you're delivering to the marketplace. But there are certainly, when I say products, I guess I say, you know, that with a small p, right? Because it's services, it's all of the things that are bundled together that are, right, part of the offering that we bring to the market that we serve. So it makes an awful lot of sense. So a lot of work that we do it has to do with agile teams and the agile process generally. And so what I thought we would talk about today, and there are certainly a whole bunch of things that we could have talked about, right? So if you think about what happens in an agile world, whether you're directly part of an agile team as an engineer or a product owner, or part of the rest of the organization that interacts with agile teams, and maybe even working in an agile way yourself, right? You might be in a marketing or an operations position. There are a lot of these parts of the agile process that impact you or potentially have the, you know, an opportunity to impact you. And so we decided we would talk about retrospectives because that seems to be, you know, if you think about what a retrospective is, this opportunity to pause in your process and think about, you know, basically have a time to review how it's going with the team members. You know, obviously that's a very specific practice in Scrum. But it actually happens across all different kinds of projects, whether you think you're following Scrum or not. So we thought it was a really nice topic to start with, thinking about how teams collaborate. And the purpose in this case for collaboration is what we call the retrospective. So what we want to talk about today would be kind of the purposes behind retrospective. So why do we do it in the first place? And then how do we know if that process is starting to have issues, right? How can we tell that there might be problems? And let's then think about, well, what are some of the causes that are common that start to make the retrospective process maybe difficult or stale, or the perception might be that it loses its effectiveness. Right, so then, you know, with that in mind, how do we keep them fresh and productive? And then I wanted to introduce another kind of retrospective, you know, thinking about, okay, well, if we can do this with a team, maybe there's an opportunity to scale this across an enterprise and think about how do you retrospect across an organization. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let's start with, well, why do we have retrospectives, right? Why do we do this? Really, it's because we want to improve performance and we want to improve the cohesiveness of the team. So I think, you know, certainly many people, when they hear the term retrospective, they think, oh, that's, you know, the conversation about what's working, what's not working, you know, kind of looking for things that are broken that we can improve. That is certainly one reason for having a retrospective. But really, I think if you're thinking about improving the performance of a team, there's other ways of phrasing questions that the team might want to grapple with that are much more than just what's broken and what can we fix, right? So over the course of our talk today, we'll be talking about some of those other questions and other frameworks that you might want to use with your team that go beyond just what's broken and what do we want to fix, and all impact improving the performance of a team. All right, so why don't we look at
Laura, I just have a quick question for you. As we go through this, we do have a lot of folks that are traditional PMP, and they might not be using the Scrum methodology very often. So can we just spend a minute bridging over how retrospectives compare to other PMP methodologies? Because it's a debrief, it's a wrap up, it's valuable whether it's in the Scrum methodology or whether you're just using it for regular project management methodology.
Oh, thanks for reminding me to talk about that. I've certainly been working in the Agile community for a while now, but before I knew about Agile personally, we were still having in the teams that I worked in what I would call a retrospective without actually using that term for it, right? So, way back in the day, we would call them project postmortems. If the project were long and time consuming, there might be points along the way where we just have check-ins, right? How is it going? What are the roadblocks you're running into? So from a management perspective, I don't think this is new at all, right? Managers and teams have been doing this type of meeting or this type of get-together for quite some time. I think what Scrum and Agile have done is to perhaps formalize it in a way that and provide a ceremony around it and some help in conducting them in a particular kind of way that's useful for Scrum teams. But yeah, as we talk about this stuff, oftentimes there are people who are not necessarily consciously or practicing Agile in a trained kind of way, and they start to think, shoot, we've been doing a lot of this stuff all along. Right, so thanks for reminding me about that, Fallon and Danielle. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Just if you come off mute, yeah.
I think the biggest difference, obviously, between the traditional retrospectives and now is really the timing. On more advanced projects I was on, we did try to do some mid-project closeouts, but the postmortems and everything are always done after the fact, which is kind of silly when you think about it. How do we continuously improve if we're really not doing it midstream? So
that's true. It's like asking everybody at the end of the day how the temperature in the room is, right? Okay, it was freezing all day, or it was hot all day. You're asking me, and then we do have Bill just commented. We've also called them lessons learned, and Todd commented. We call them after action reviews. So now everybody's on the same page. I just wanted to make sure that we bridged that. Thank you.
All right. So whether you're doing them, more frequently, which is certainly in the Agile world, it's checking in on the temperature, a few times over the course of the day before you get to the end, or you're doing them a little less frequently. That's a whole nother kind of topic about what Agile means to the whole organization. So I'll probably continue to talk about Agile and Scrum a little bit, but I'll also point out opportunities to think about some of the things we'll talk about outside of what I would call a traditional Scrum team.
Great.
All right, so if you are conducting periodic check-ins with your team, whether this is every couple of weeks, once a month, once every 6 weeks, that cadence is something that you have probably some kind of cadence for this in your team, and more frequently, without getting crazy with it, more frequently is probably better than less frequently. But as you're doing this, right, and checking in on how things are going, there are certain signs that come up where they tend to be indicators that this process of checking in to figure out how can we improve how we're doing the work that we do as a team, it's not going so well, right? So, things staying on the to-do list forever, right? So these are things we want to do better. These are things we want to improve. And every time you have a retrospective meeting, it's the same list and it never seems to change, right? That kind of what's working and what's not and what are we going to do about it, right? That kind of meeting can get really emotionally draining for people when that list never changes, right? So that's certainly one sign. lack of ownership in terms of who's going to either resolve an issue or take ownership of that issue or move it forward, improve it in some kind of way. That is a classic sign that something isn't quite working if ownership isn't taken over things that are uncovered in those kinds of meetings. Not having them anymore, actually. This certainly happens often in Scrum teams or new teams where initially you seem to have a really great cadence for these kinds of check-ins. And over time, they start to become things that people skip altogether, or they don't attend, or they're put off, and you lose your I guess your cadence for this, right? What used to be every 2 to 3 weeks now becomes once every 2 to 3 months, and people are not looking forward to them. So when that starts to happen, you know that something's not quite working. So there are a number of reasons why this might happen. And so I thought I'd go over some of the more common ones that we run into when we work with teams, whether they're agile or yet to be calling themselves agile teams. There is a role that happens in these meetings. So in a Scrum team, you have a Scrum Master, and they will frequently be the ones who facilitate the retrospective. After a while, having the same person run this meeting can just be boring, right? And so what we find in high-functioning companies is that they may consciously rotate the facilitator of the retrospective meeting, so that the same person and perhaps the same style and the same, the familiarity of that kind of meeting can end up kind of squashing some creativity. So one reason might be just as simple as if you're always using the same facilitator for your retrospective, you may want to shake that up a little bit and ask a colleague who also facilitates these kinds of discussions to trade meetings with you and just give the group and yourself a fresh perspective on what's going on.
Laura, can I jump in there?
Please do.
I just wanted to reinforce Scrum specifically says that the Scrum Master should get a neutral facilitator so that they can participate as a team member. So not only is it a best practice from a facilitation perspective, from a pure Scrum perspective, the Scrum Master is actually supposed to be a participant. So I always recommend, if I'm working on a project on a company with multiple projects, I'll have other project managers or other Scrum Masters do my retrospectives, and I'll do theirs.
Yeah, it makes impartiality and the ability to ask interesting questions a little easier if you're not neck deep in the content, definitely. So
I wasn't going to say anything, but it's just slightly Freudian that they use their CEO for that picture.
Well, I thought, whose photo could I put in there and kind of bash it? God, if you saw this guy every time you had a retrospective, wouldn't that get a little dull? And I just knew that Luke wouldn't mind if,
Yes, highly Freudian. Okay, that's Luke Holmes, CEO of Contenio.
All right. So we'll get Luke out of there and on to the next one then. So I think another thing that makes this difficult and might make your meeting a bit stale is how hard it is to wear multiple hats if you're the facilitator. So Daniel, this gets on your point a little bit, where in an ideal world, you have access to people that you can trade this role with to have that type of meeting with your team to talk about, kind of this goal of process improvement or the improvement of the work output that you're doing. But I just had a conversation, not a week ago, from a Scrum Master at one of our companies clients that we work with. And he was really struggling with, hey, I'm supposed to be leading this meeting and a participant of this meeting. And I'm also on the architecture committee for the security side of what we do. And it's really hard for me to have a good retrospective, right? I kind of feel like I'm schizophrenic. I don't know if I'm supposed to be talking about the security element of what we're actually working on, or am I supposed to be the process person leading the meeting? And unfortunately for their situation, there really wasn't an opportunity to say, oh, we just need to have a third party or another person come in and do it. The reality of the organization was that he just had to wear multiple hats. Right. So in this case, we had a kind of agile coaches meeting to talk about, well, what are some of the facilitation techniques that you can use to manage the fact that you're not in a perfect world and you do actually have to wear multiple hats in your retrospective meeting. So there are a lot of things that people can do to improve facilitation techniques, but actually in this case, the visualization of, hey, I'm wearing 3 hats in this meeting, and now I'm putting on my Scrum Master hat, and I'm going to be a facilitator of this meeting, and oh, now I'm moving on to my architecture hat, to actually make those comments to the team was the facilitation tip that was given to that particular Scrum Master with this problem. So I should check back in with him and see how that worked. But sometimes having something to say both to yourself and to the team that, okay, now I'm speaking in this particular role, it just helps the team and the facilitator of the meeting make sense of the kind of craziness that it can feel like if you're wearing multiple hats in a single meeting. Fallon or Daniel, I don't know if you have anything to add to this, but I you know, this is something that's now come up a couple of times recently in conversations I've had.
Yeah, I think this is especially helpful whenever you are wearing multiple hats, but in one role you are having something that's a difficulty, but in your other role it's actually helping you. And so if you don't have that cue that you can say to the audience to say, this is helping me, and then 5 minutes later you're saying this is actually a detriment, that is very difficult because you're sending different signals. And so whenever you can actually put on this hat, you can say, as a Scrum Master, this piece is very difficult for me, but as part of the architecture team, it's really helpful. And so being able to actually say those things audibly is really helpful for the people who are with you.
Yep. All right.
I just asked if anybody from the audience has some ideas. Go ahead and chat them in, because sometimes, many times, you guys, I hear it all the time. As far as I can tell, nobody has unlimited resources. So even if you're at a very large company, that's the company's opportunity to give you a huge portfolio. So if other people have ideas around that, I'd love to hear from you. Just kind of chat them in as we go. Thank you.
So this is, I think, getting back into some facilitation skills again. And so, Daniel, I'm sure that this is a lot of the training that you're working on, or what are the skills that are required to help people collaborate more effectively. And so, having the same question come up over and over and over again has actually potentially a lot of root causes, but just generally this happening, if your retrospectives are the same every week, and it's the same content that comes up, and it's the same problem brought up by the same person, that really is a recipe for the meeting no longer being functional or useful, or even something that people will attend, right? So this is an issue that definitely needs to be addressed. And in a couple of minutes, we'll start talking about solutions for this stuff in more detail. But yeah, if this is happening, you're gonna have to find a way, right, to change the way you're doing retrospectives so that this doesn't become, the biggest anchor of, for your meeting being successful. A couple more indicators that you're having problems is that you kind of go through the same structure for the meeting every single time, right? If your meeting for your retrospective or your process improvement meeting is always about, okay, what's working right now, what should we improve, and what are we going to do to fix it? If this is all you ever do, right, the meeting, just human nature means that this meeting is going to become boring, right? It'll become less effective over time. And this is actually true for any kind of process status meeting. One of the meetings I attend regularly is just a status on sales, right? And if we always have a discussion about, here's your funnel of accounts and here's where they are in the sales cycle and what closed, right? If that's the only way we ever have a sales meeting, they're truly not fun, and they're not very creativity inspiring either. Right, so if you constantly do it the same way, that might be an indicator that you're going to either, if you're not aware of problems, you're going to probably end up running into some. And then the last one I think is really interesting that we'll talk about is also the kinds of things that come up in your retrospective meeting. What is the scope of the control the team has to address them, right? So if this were a representation of the ideas that we come up with in a retrospective meeting, I would imagine that the people would feel pretty empowered, right, and feel good about the output of this meeting. Because if you think about it, and this, by the way, comes from an Agile coach. Her name is Diana Larson. She's super smart, interesting person. But this is one of the frameworks that she uses. And in this case, you can see that a lot of the issues that have come up that the team have identified are actually within the team's scope of control. right? There's a number of them that they have some influence over, and the soup, or the area where they don't really have any control at all over it, there's not that much out there right now. So this is a pretty fertile area for this team to work on improvements. They could certainly have a lot of impact over what their team produces. But on the flip side, if this is the kind of stuff they're coming up with, right, where everything they're talking about that's causing them to be less productive than they want to be is totally outside their scope of control, this is a source of frustration for teams, right? So as a leader of this group, as a facilitator of this conversation with this team, you need a strategy to deal with this. Otherwise, it's unlikely that this meeting will be something that people look forward to, and it's unlikely to be something you get a lot of value out of. So we're going to end up talking about strategies for keeping them useful and fresh. But before I move on to that part of the conversation, are there any comments that my panelists want to make, or are there any questions that are coming up in the chat that we want to throw into the conversation right now?
Sure, Laura, I want to jump in on there, and I think just to mention Diana Larson, she wrote a book with Esther Derby. I'm sure you know it. I'll put it on the chat. Agile Retrospectives, Making Good Teams Great. So that's kind of the Bible for all the best different techniques that kind of mix it up. But regardless, like you said, of all the different techniques you use, if the team isn't overcoming those obstacles and the same obstacles are coming up every single week, you hit that point where, yes, nobody wants to attend the retrospectives anymore because they're not valuable. But I had a colleague of mine, and he did a lot of studies on this, is what ends up happening is a team gets to a certain point in performing. So each sprint they're retrospecting, they're continuously improving up until a point, and then all of the impediments that they're facing are organizational and they have no control. Mm-hmm. And what they're finding on these high-performing teams, or these potentially high-performing teams, is not only is the retrospective an issue, but they're seeing a significant impact on retention of good staff. Because people want to go work someplace where they don't have those organizational impediments. So it's the transparency of the retrospective is great, but it also kind of pulls back the curtain and says, oh, we can only be so effective as a team, but our organization is preventing us from being even more effective. So that's one of the kind of the pros and cons of retrospective. Organizations have to realize once you allow the team to be potentially high performing, you have to help remove those impediments at that level that's outside of their control.
Yeah, that's I love that point. And in fact, you know, in a couple more slides, we'll talk about, well, if that's what you've just, you know, if that's what's happening to your team, there's some mechanisms that we want to suggest in terms of how you manage that. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Daniel. All right, so let's see, click in the right spot here. All right. So one of the ways is, and we alluded to this in the beginning, but to vary the goal or the objective of the retrospective. Yes, it is actually really effective to have the conversation about what's holding you back, or what's holding us back as a team, right? What are the problems that we're running into? How painful are they? What are some of the great things we're doing? You know, what do we want to improve and fix next time? But there are other things that could happen at a retrospective that are equally valuable in terms of improving the performance of a team. Right, so one of the things that I like to just check in on with the Agile coaches and other Scrum Masters that I work with is how often is your retrospective just about acknowledging and celebrating successes? Right, it's like people work really hard, right, and there are things that happen that are truly worthy of discussion and celebration. And so having the occasional retrospective where you as a team get to come together and celebrate amazing things is it's a very energizing kind of meeting. And it is a fantastic way to vary the topics that happen in these kind of regular check-ins that you have with your team. Another example that we did recently with one of our clients is to actually work with the teams around a question around innovation, right? So if you look at the left side of your screen where it says find new technologies, this is a retrospective framework that Luke Hellman, the guy's photo that I used earlier, he invented this framework to talk about how do we look at the arc of technology that our teams are actually using. So for those of you who are not in an engineering team, you'll have to kind of run with this example with me for just a minute. But if you have things that are happening in the way you're developing software, either the technologies that you're using to build on or what's being delivered to your clients, Agile teams have an awful lot to offer in terms of how do we want to innovate over time with our product, right? So what are some of the parts of our technology stack that we might need to migrate off of, right? What's going to be end of life? How can we look at innovation in terms of jumping tech curves? How do we do something that potentially is even radical or completely evolutionary on how we want to roll out our platform over time? And it's very energizing to work with a team when they have an opportunity to think about the future potential of the project that they're working on. It's not just what's working and what's not over the last sprint, which might be, 2 to 4 weeks worth of time. But looking off into the future, what are the things that we're getting excited about that we really want to have an opportunity to discuss as a team that we think are going to impact a longer time horizon into the future that'll make us better, stronger, and able to serve our market more effectively? So those are two other ideas, and there are tons of frameworks out there, and Diana Larson certainly has a large number of them, but there's some references that we'll give you at the end of this, and Danny, you might have some other places you want to point people to. But the question can't always be what's broken and how are we going to fix it. There are so many other things that make people happy in the role that they play and make the team really productive that should be discussed and actually oftentimes should be shared with the rest of the organization as well. Anything that you guys want to add to this one?
I think the one thing that the Scrum community talks about in celebrating success, and I don't necessarily agree 100% on this, but we have to make sure that the success is recognized by the team and not from the top down, so that the boss isn't always coming in and saying good job, or the Scrum master isn't saying good job. It's the team is acknowledging their success. And the reason they make a big deal about this is they don't want that command and control environment where that reward type of environment is only coming from the top. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways I do this in retrospectives is prior to a retrospective, if I'm facilitating, I'll send out a survey and say anonymously or from a team perspective, who did something above and beyond during this last sprint? Who does the team kind of want to recognize within this sprint? And again, it's I have no problem with someone coming in and saying great job if it's the CEO or someone else, but the Scrum community, especially if you're going after certification, this is one of those trick questions on any of the exams. Just be careful that you don't create this reward type of hierarchy, that it's really tried to create it at the team level.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And, just think about your own human nature side of it where, the acknowledgement of something that others appreciate. Sure, I'm happy when Luke gives me a call and tells me, as the CEO, he's excited about something. But in fact, if Fallon says, hey, that was a great article you wrote, that means just as much to me. So I think, understanding what that mix needs to be for your team and making sure there's a space for that is definitely important to be conscious about.
That's a really good point, you guys. I like that a lot. We also have a comment here from Whitney. She says, in the past, we prioritized the what can be approved category and implemented the top 3 from each meeting, which shows action on the improvement list so that people can continually see it cycling through the implementation and the movement. So that was also another thing that it's good, like here's something we want to work on, not just always in the future, but we want to improve these things so everybody can see progress. I think that's important too.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that one out. All right. So if we look at some other ideas, to also vary the framework that you use. So you may want to talk about what's working and what's not, but there are actually a number of frameworks that you can use to help people think about that. So for example, Speedboat is something that we use quite a bit. We'll talk a little bit more as we go through the rest of this talk as well. But Speedboat is great because the metaphor that you're giving people to work with also helps them indicate how bad the problem is in a really easy visual way. So how this works is, your team is the boat and problems are anchors that hold you back, and puffs of wind are things that make you go faster and better and make, your team work better together. So the metaphor is kind of obvious, right? The deeper the anchor, the worse the problem. So that this is a screenshot of a retro that we did with a team, and it was kind of neat because I could immediately look at it and say, oh, well, I can tell what your worst problem is right now relative to all the other things that you're struggling with. So sometimes just, you know, varying the framework or varying the metaphor can help people think a little bit differently about the problem. So Diana has a bunch of these in her book. There's some links at the end of this that gives you other places to go. But visually having a different way to work with your team, and varying either the metaphor or the structure of how you want to kind of answer the question you pose them will also help people feel very engaged and provide some more creative answers to the question that might actually help the team, right? It just keeps it from being boring, right? All right, some other things that you can do. You don't always have to have your retrospective meeting in meeting room A down the hall, right? So I don't know if I'd want to have my team meeting on a happy hour offsite, but you know what? Doing it as a walking meeting, or getting outside if the sun is out, or you know, going to the cafeteria and doing it over a cup of coffee, like varying the location actually does something to the creativity engine inside your brain, right? It just it makes the I guess the opportunity for other people to engage in your question, that changes as well. I mean, you may find that your introvert in a meeting room around a round meeting table becomes your extrovert if you're sitting outside having a cup of coffee in the sunshine. So it's a way to you know, just again keep the creativity side of it, and also keep the meeting itself from getting kind of stale and painful. I don't know if you guys have any stories about other places or other ways of, or other frameworks of holding these retrospective meetings, but if you guys have other things you want to share, go ahead.
Because they can be painful, I always try to fit them over lunch too, and a lot of organizations now won't pay for lunch. So one of the techniques I do is anybody who's late for my daily scrums has to pay $1. And some people just give me $20 up front at the beginning of the sprint and say I'm going to be late every day. But that becomes our lunch money. So at the end of the sprint, that pays for our retrospective lunches. So just wanted to throw that out there.
I have a couple comments coming in. So one thing we did at Omnikron that's different is I put some things together on Sway and OneNote. And then during the meeting, I said, everybody, please bring your phone. Like I want your face in your phone, which is just completely the opposite from how you usually run a meeting. But I figured that let's get in the phone. I want you guys to see the tool. And it was just different than how we tactically would normally run a meeting. We have a couple questions, Laura. You really piqued people's interest on that backpack methodology the slide ago. So some folks want to hear about what does that mean. And then we do have a couple questions about how to change the environment if you're working in a virtual distributed team. That person must be paid from Centennial, because that's great. So I don't know about that, but we do have an answer for you there. But is there time to go back to help us understand what backpacking means?
Yeah, so right at the end, I think we'll have some time to go through that. Somebody did post the link. So Ben Linders has a great website with a bunch of suggestions on how to run retrospectives, and so backpacking is something that he covers. So there's a link in the chat if you wanted to click on that quickly. And I guess what I want to say about the question about what do you do if you're a remote team? So yeah, that was actually really interesting. So I think there are times you can vary the environment by specifically doing something like we're doing right now, which is to incorporate video so you can see people's faces. I don't know if I'd want to do that all the time, but if you're doing that occasionally where you have, this is purposely a video meeting where we actually want to see people's faces, that can help with you know, creating a sense of team if you actually know who your folks are and you can see them sometimes. When you're remote, varying the time of day, especially if your distributed team has multiple time zones, right? Like we've asked Daniel to get here a bit early in his day, and he's calling in from Hawaii. But if we made him get up at 5 a.m. all the time, I know it's not 5 a.m. there, but if it were, you know, we picked your 5 a.m. time all the time, that would be unfair to him. And one of the ways of varying the environment is to pick a different time of day, so that nobody suffers full pain all the time, and you know, people think differently early in the morning versus lunchtime-ish versus towards the end of the day. And then the last suggestion I would have would be to vary the framework and use an online tool. So we'll give you some suggestions, and certainly one of the reasons I was excited to talk to you guys today is that Contenio has an online platform for helping with distributed teams and all kinds of remote work that needs to happen, and a collection of retrospectives, including a whole bunch from folks like Diana Larson, are in the platform. So varying the environment for a distributed team is probably more oriented towards the tool you're using. Are you going to put video in it or not? What framework are you going to use? So you vary that, and then vary the time of day. Fallon or Daniel, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that question.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've worked a lot with co-located teams, and one of the things that helps to vary the environment, in my experience, is to start off the meeting in a different way each time. And so we would rotate this duty amongst the team members, and you could start the meeting off in any way that you wanted to. And so for some, they would pick a funny video that they would share, and everybody would watch that video, and they would come to that meeting having that in mind, and it just kind of started the meeting off in a different way. Another way to do that that I've seen is that teams would take a photo of what their workspace looks like. A lot of times, like right now, you just see the back of the wall behind me, but what do I see all day long? And so they would share those photos before the meeting or at the very start of it, so that you could kind of get a peek into what their environment looks like. And it just helps to bring some of the human aspect into a co-located meeting.
Yes, those are great ideas. All right, so if we move on here, we talked about varying the facilitator. I don't know if we need to talk about this too much more, but certainly getting a colleague or a group, a person from another group to help you out, so that you, if you're in that team, can play, you know, wear one hat and be a team member rather than the facilitator. Being a facilitator is, it's challenging because your role is to focus on process, not content, right? And so that's why people have a really hard time being both a team member and the person who's supposed to be paying attention to the process that you're following in that particular meeting. So if you have the luxury of only paying attention to process and making sure that people are all having an opportunity to be engaged and everyone feels that they've had an opportunity to contribute in any way that they can, you know, those are things that the facilitator will focus on. And if you feel that you're going to have a hard time managing process while being a content contributor, then if you can find someone to help take the role of facilitator, that will make the meeting different for you and probably for the people in your group as well. All right. So Daniel, this is why I was kind of excited about you mentioning the earlier comment that when the problems or the issues that a team starts to percolate up tend to all be outside the scope of control of a single team, that's certainly a point in time where the excitement or retrospective starts to dip, right? You're a new team, you do them a lot, you get a lot of stuff happening, you become high performing, and as soon as you think you're getting really good at things, all of a sudden your desire to retrospect starts to dip and they become less effective, right? So to vary the scope of a retrospective is another way to address some of those problems that cause teams to stop wanting to do them, right? So we call it either a large scale retrospective, sometimes we call them an enterprise-wide retrospective. But what we're looking for is what are the things that are going on that are outside the scope of control of a single team. So the results of what we call a multi-team retrospective, what we're looking for are, again, outside the scope of control, but also are the problems that the team running into kind of technology-focused problems? Are they related to process, or are they people? And sometimes I rename people other because no one really likes to say, hey, Fred is the cause of all of my problems. So people is you know, one of those categorizations that we play around with a little bit. But I'm definitely interested when we start looking at large numbers of teams retrospecting together, like in parallel, when we know we're looking for problems that are outside a single team scope of control to fix. I'm personally quite interested in the mix between things that might be technology related and process related. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you do this and what you can uncover, right? So here's a screenshot of part of a report that we ended up building for one of our clients who did this. I think it was, oh, it says right here, 42 Scrum teams. We used the Speedboat retrospective, and what we asked them to do is to visually show, based on all the anchors and puffs of wind, what's working and what's not relative to things like, you know, technology, processes, and in this case, we did talk about people. So what's interesting here is that you can see that within the teams, they have an alpha. You can't really see the colors when I put that on there, but in the team side of things, there's a whole lot of green and blue, which is, you know, those are positive wind puffs, right? So a lot of these teams have reached that perspective where, hey, they feel like they're high performing, and any anchors they would have run into, they've already dealt with them, right? So they're cooking, right? They're doing really well. But if you look at on the enterprise scope of control, way outside of what the team is up to, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. You know, it's very, again, I'll kind of go backwards, but it's very red, right? There's a lot of anchors, a lot of problems in there, and they're actually fairly interspersed between technology, process, and people. So if I'm in a position of an organization where I can impact more than one team, I am really interested in drilling into this kind of enterprise area, or Diana will call this the soup, right? In that particular framework. I want to know what these things are, because as a leader in the leadership or part of the organization, without my help or without that part of the enterprise engaging here, no team is going to make any impact on solving those problems. Right? So the way this works is you would use an online platform. Weave is the platform that Contenio is built. There might be other ways of doing this, although I'm purposely biased, so I'll talk about how we do this in Weave. But we used the Speedboat framework with 42 teams. They each scheduled their retrospective to do it online using the platform. So even teams that could have met together in a conference room and used a whiteboard, for this particular project, we wanted the data to analyze across all teams in a very easy way to look at. So they all used Speedboat online, and they asked the question, what's working and what's not, and then also the severity question was answered based on the placement of the anchor, right? The deeper the anchor, the worse the problem. The second step is all of those anchors and puffs of wind were analyzed based on, you know, what area did they fall into? Was it a process anchor? Was it a technology anchor? And so on. And then we identified these areas for opportunity and kind of organized them in a way of themes and potential projects that could be green lighted in order to resolve these problems. So what, in the case that I brought up, what we ended up with across the 42 Scrum teams were about 15 projects that the leadership team said, look, any one of these 15 would cut a really significant anchor that would impact positively a large number of teams, but they're all fairly significant, right? If they were simple things to do, we would just do all 15. So they went back to the teams using a prioritization framework that's available in Weave and said, okay, of these 15, let's collaboratively prioritize these projects, right? So at the end of the day, the teams understood where the data came from. They understood why that these projects were the ones that were eventually identified as potential work to do in order to improve the Agile process. And then they also felt very invested in the choices they made about which one they were going to pursue. So they went all the way from ideation all the way down to prioritizing the project they were going to pursue. So Daniel, I don't know if you have any questions that you want to pose, or if there are any of them that are coming from the group at large. But it would be, you know, this is kind of an interesting way of taking a retrospective and saying, okay, how do we scale it?
Yeah, no, I've not seen your tool before, so it looks very cool. I think you need to post the link to the tool or the name. I'm not even sure I understand the name. Is it Weave or Wave?
Weave, yeah, it's called Weave, and at the last slide here, which everyone will get at the end of this, there's a whole bunch of links, including the link to that.
Cool. No, I'll definitely try it out.
So Fallon has been a facilitator with me many times to help with facilitating the individual team retrospectives. And I don't know if you have anything to talk about in terms of how it went for you as a facilitator and what you learned and what you kind of, you know, any suggestions about what people should think about like this.
Yeah, I did have the opportunity to do an enterprise retrospective with you with some of the individual teams. And one of the key pieces for me as a facilitator, one of the learnings that I had was that in using a framework like Speedboat, it really took the output to a completely different level. Normally, whenever I've seen retrospectives, you really focus on just the what's going well, what's not going well. And it's really hard to identify the severity immediately within the framework. And so when you're using something like Sailboat or Speedboat, the team is able to collaboratively together agree on the depth that the anchor should belong to. And so you're really using the visual metaphor in a way that's very natural for people, because in real life, the lower the anchor, the bigger the impediment. And so that's something that you can easily relate to whenever you're seeing it visually in this way. And so using something that is a little more multidimensional is really helpful for teams. And I think the second thing that I would say specifically from a facilitator perspective is that when you're using a framework that is structured in this way, you'll see the team really starts to just go at it on their own, and they don't necessarily need the facilitator throughout the entire event. So at the beginning, the facilitator is heavily explaining what the rules are of engagement, kind of how to participate in this type of event. But the structure of a framework like Sailboat really starts to just go on its own. Once the participants have the flow, they can easily start to just engage in the framework. And so the facilitator can kind of take a step back, and instead of the facilitator really leading the entire meeting, the framework just in and of itself helps to lead the meeting. And that really just allows for the participants to equally and collaboratively lead that session. So those are some of the things that I think have worked really well whenever you're using a framework like this.
Yeah, it just promotes kind of good ideas and also ownership of the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
All right. So for distributed teams, again, we talked about this a little bit. I already threw some of these ideas out here. But I think even if you're, like, we have one team member, actually now that Fallon has moved to the Bay Area, we don't have as many distributed people on our team, but we do have one team member who's based out of Munich. Actually, no, he's in Berlin now. And we could have a meeting and put him on a conference call. And we have, in-person meeting with one remote person. But what we've actually found is that there's a number of opportunities for us to use our own platform, Weave, so that we can incorporate Robert in a much more egalitarian kind of way, right? So if we use an online platform and we provide a framework to help the discussion we're having, right? So sometimes it is a retrospective, but other times we're using Weave as a planning tool or an estimation tool of work. Robert is on our engineering team. And it's a way to make sure that Robert is as engaged with the task at hand as the people who are in the room together are. Right, so we do this ourselves, right? We make sure that we're picking a time zone that's good for everybody, and that it's not the same time every time, but we're conscious of Robert's time zone. We use Weave and frameworks online a lot, so that Robert, who's got English as a second language, although his English is amazing, but still German is his first language. So for him, having a framework helps with communication, and it also kind of levels the playing field between him who's remote and the 3 or 4 of us who might be in a meeting room. Not sure that we have any super quiet introverts, but again, there are times when any one of us might be faced with some kind of intellectual challenge in the meeting that we're in, where it's hard for us to actually articulate what we want to say, right? So visually, if we can think it through that way, and if we can type our thoughts, we have an opportunity to phrase things the way we want it to. So I actually think using an online platform, especially for a distributed team, gives folks the chance to contribute more thoughtfully and completely, because they're not having to stand up in front of the room and just talk, right? They have an opportunity to write it down or to type. So these are some strategies for helping distributed teams improve. So we're about finished here. We talked about quite a bit, so changing the question, changing the location and the environment that you're going to be asking how can we improve as a team? Not just thinking about problems, but varying the goal. Sometimes you might want to talk about innovation. Sometimes you might want to talk about a longer time horizon. You might want to talk about celebrating successes. you know, just making sure that as the leader of this kind of meeting, that you're trying your best to keep the questions interesting and relevant and varied. We talked about some resources that you'll have. So again, this will get sent to you at the end, but you know, you might want to click on the first one. We have a list of some retrospectives that you can try online for distributed teams. So there's a link there at the top of that slide for you. We also provide framework training, and so there's some really low-cost online options that we host at a platform called Udemy. So there's we talked a lot about Sailboat Speedboat. So if you want to learn how to do that, there's a bit.ly link that you can click to take a look at that online on-demand course. If you want to try Weave yourself, there's a 30-day free trial that you can have access to. Actually, just by trying any of those retrospective techniques on the first link, you'll end up getting a 30-day trial to the platform. And if you want to upgrade, we have a 25% upgrade coupon for all of you on the call today. So as long as you do that by the middle of next month, there's a discount code as well. And then there's some other resources. Daniel, you've mentioned Diana's book. There might be other things that you want to add to in terms of resources that you like to go to for retrospective ideas. So if you want to throw those into chat, if you haven't done that already. But there's a lot out there that really should help you think about, well, what are the appropriate questions I could be engaging my team with? What's the appropriate time horizon that I want to hand to them? How can I you know, use the variety of frameworks to kind of keep the meeting fresh and interesting? And then, you know, the scaling the retrospective meeting across a larger collection of teams. We do that kind of work. We would love to help you with that, but I did also provide some links on how to do that on your own. So if you look at that link up there, you know, there's some suggestions about how to approach that kind of retrospective project if you want to take a crack at that as well.
So, Laura, I want to kind of give people a little bit more of an overview of what we're talking about. What Contenio has done, they're located in Silicon Valley, and they've created an online platform called Weave. And I've known Luke probably since, I don't know, 2010 or something. Really good guy, wonderful company. And he's been working on this tool. It's like a mashup between a WebEx and a Google form, where, you know, we could all be in the tool at the same time, so I could see everybody there. And we can do any type of framework that we want. So let's go with that speedboat game. Speedboat, for those that aren't familiar with it, you can do speedboat or sailboat. You just take the metaphor of the boat, and folks will come in and comment on, you know, so the boat is your project. What's an anchor? Like, what's holding us back? And depending on the severity of the roadblock, you know, it's like close to the water or way down deep. And then what's putting, you know, what's a propeller or putting wind in our sail, depending on what kind of boat you used, which is good. It's working out good. Like, the team is really good. So that's a gust of wind. The time that we're doing, or the project, whatever it is, that's the sailboat game. So if you imagine that you just got a picture of a sailboat in the Contenio Weave tool, we could all come in together right now, and we could grab a sticky, or we could grab an anchor or a gust of wind, and we could start typing in the tool. What's super cool about that is I could chat with you. I could like whisper privately something to you, like, hey, Laura, I don't know if I really should say this. Is that okay to say? Or what do you think about that? At the end of the session, and the reason why Contenio is able to keep it open for their engineer in Berlin is you can keep these sessions open. They don't just have to come together when we're together. You can open a forum and leave it open for a week or a month or what have you. At the end of the time, not only do you get that really cool visual, everybody's got to put their opinion in and their notes and be heard. But then you also get a report out of the back side. So not only do I get the visual, but I also get a really cool report that I can use for decision making and further analysis. So that speedboat is just one metaphor. They have every framework you can imagine already pre-built into the tool. Omnikron uses it. The reason why I like it is we use it in our classes with change management and advanced problem solving. And it's really wonderful tool to be able to let people think, be heard, make decisions, be concise. And it's a nice addition to the if you're using regular project management methodology, product lifecycle development, of course, Scrum and Agile. So I don't know that, I just wanted to give everybody kind of a layman's term of what that tool is and what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that for you throwing that in there. And what I would say is, you have my contact information and Fallon's on there as well. And so if you, you just want a half an hour personal tour of this, or you've got a particular business problem or a team collaboration challenge in front of you, if you want to talk about ways that we might help you, or you want some framework suggestions, we would be more than happy to set up a time to chat with you about that. So please reach out and send us an email if you want to talk more about frameworks or the platform or distributed teams or scaling retrospectives, all that stuff.
Thank you. What's tastycupcakes.org, Dan? Is that just because it's lunchtime, or is that also something?
Yeah, no, tastycupcakes.org is the Agile community's kind of repository for interactive games and team building and all different techniques that I've used for icebreakers at retrospectives and things like that. So it's a strange name. I'm not sure where it came from, but yeah, that's pretty much you can find anything there around those types of activities.
I like that a lot. Thank you for sharing that. The chat is so good. We'll make sure that we save the chat and everybody gets it. Guys, yeah, we have some really good links here. So the chat is as good of a resource as I wanted it to be. For those who are here today that are looking for your PDUs, you get one for attending and then a bonus one. If you email greattraining@omnikron.com and you just tell us, so I'm typing that, for those that need the PDU, want the PDU for your talent triangle, you can get two. If you just email us at greattraining@omnikron.com, there it is, and tell us what you learned from today's session. And then the Omnikron team will wonderfully send you a beautiful certificate with instructions for exactly how to load that up into the PMI registry. So some folks are, already up to like 6 PDUs in just 3 short weeks. So they're collecting them like awesome badges. What other questions do you guys have? There's just some pretty good things on this slide here. Any other questions from the audience while you have the great Contenio team and also Dan? You have a lot of thought leadership here. Go ahead and send us some questions in the chat box. And this other one that you sent, the project management one, Dan, is that a description of the sailboat project?
As you were talking about what this comes from, I just posted a picture of one from one of my retros. So.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. I think probably everybody is busy clicking on links today. This is a very fun. You know what I would love is, I'd love to come back. I know we didn't plan for this, but Laura and Fallon, I'd love to come back and actually do a game. So I'd love maybe, working it out with Heather and the team here and your schedules too. Just invite everybody into a team game. Everybody would get a link. We could all practice with the tool. It's super fun. So I think one of our upcoming webinars could be just playing a game together. Maybe we could plan for the holidays or something. We could do something fun.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think, Heather and I have been talking about one of the things that we'd like to get feedback on are, that we have a couple of ideas for other topics we could talk about, but that, if you guys are open to it, we could also talk about a couple of different frameworks that we could use and invite everybody to join and, just get some feedback on which one of a couple of them would be most appealing to people. So yeah, I would say I'm totally, open to doing that.
Okay.
And there was actually one other question that came in that I think is interesting. So maybe before we close, we can get to that, which is, how do you get sponsorship for doing these things? How do you get executive sponsorship for more creative retrospectives? Daniel, I'd love to get your take on this, but there's a couple of thoughts that I have, which is, that from the perspective of an individual team, right, how they get to that high performing team and how they're effectively identifying areas for improvement and how they want to tackle those things. Very often, I think that happens completely under the radar of the senior leadership, right? It's like how you run that, 15 to 30-minute meeting is really the business of the team, and that is the definition of a self-empowered team. Right now, where executive sponsorship might become into play is like if you're to take this, like, hey, maybe you've been using things like Speedboat or Circles and Soup, and actually, getting a lot of good input from that, and you're starting to think, what, if we could do this with 6 Scrum teams or 30 Scrum teams, we would really get some amazing stuff going on. Then you need to take it to the executive leadership to get approval for that, and that's where, having kept track of the progress that your team has made and how things like Speedboat has helped and having some kind of record of improvement can actually really benefit. It's like, yeah, Speedboat might sound a bit crazy, but hey, look at what we've done over the last 3 months or 6 months, right? These were anchors that we've identified along the way, and these are things that we've chosen to cut, and here's how we've improved our velocity or our output or our ability to take on work, or, our defect rate has gone down. I mean, there might be a lot of things that you can show that, by using, simple frameworks for the retrospective, we've really improved as a team, and there's no reason to believe we couldn't do that as an experiment for larger groups. I don't know if you guys have any other comments to add before we have to close today.
I think it's a great question on sponsorship, and I think I referenced this book last week, or I meant to. It's called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, and it's talking about change management overall, just for your family, your office, your company, your community, the world. Like,
there you go. There's a screenshot for you.
Yeah, there you go. So he talks about, one of the things they always talk about is whenever you're going to start a change, like, the change we want is actually with the stakeholder, is to go find a bright spot. Start with a bright spot wherever it is in the situation, find something that's working or somebody that's doing it right, and go interview that situation or those people and figure out why is that happening there but not happening over here. So sometimes I think, to your point, Laura, on sponsorship, if you're having really good success with something, that is your bright spot. Now it probably just needs to be campaigned a little bit, and then you do need to find at least one stakeholder that will take you up on that offer. But so many little skunkworks projects start from just the team getting excited and the team meeting their goals and high morale, high productivity, that's usually pretty contagious. Not always, but thanks for showing that picture of that book, Dan. We have probably some similar reading habits. Thank you guys, everybody. We are at the top of our time, actually. It looks like a little bit over. So if you're still with us, thank you very, very much. Please take advantage of all the offers. We'll be sending you the deck, your certificates, probably the recording, and we will see you soon for the next series of webinars. We'll be sending out a calendar soon. So look forward to your feedback, everybody. And Laura and Fallon and Dan, thank you so much. And Heather, thank you for organizing this and putting it all together. Thank you very much from all of us.